It's been another awesome year of self-hosting, and after sharing my home lab hardware tour, many of you wanted to know what I'm running on all of that hardware. Well, you're in luck because today I'm breaking it all down for you. From dashboards to hypervisors for virtualization, a NAS with plenty of storage, 5 DNS servers, yes 5, segmented networks across multiple VLANs, reverse proxies, home security, media server, link pages, link shorteners, power management, and so much more. I'll also give you a sneak peek at the services that I'm keeping, the ones I'm replacing, and some big changes I'm planning this year. Spoiler alert, I've revamped quite a bit in the last 12 months, and 2025 will be no different. If you're into self-hosting services, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of my future updates. All right, let's dive in, starting with my networks. So I have a lot of Ubiquiti devices, so naturally, I'm going to use the Unified Network Controller to manage all of my devices and some of my cameras and other things you'll see later on. But in here, you could see my network topology. Now, first you could see my fiber coming in right here, and then that connects to my EFG, and that's my gateway into my network. That was UDM SE before this, but now it's an EFG. That might go back to something a little bit more home friendly, but for now it's the EFG because I'm testing it. Then from there, downstream from there, I kind of have my core switch, and this is my Switch Aggregation Pro, and I see there's a RX fault there, but I'll look at that later. But this is my 10 gig switch, so all of my 10 gig devices connect into here, and then it uplinks at 25 gig. So down from this core switch, first I'll go this way because this goes into my studio here. In my studio, my first switch is the ProMax 24 PoE. That's right over there in a mini server rack for all of my workstations. And then from there, it connects to the Office Flex Mini, which is up there behind the TV. And that's there so I can connect all of those devices that are up there to a network and hardwire them rather than using wireless. And then from here, it should go to this USW ProMax 16 PoE. The little short one, that's actually on my workbench back there. I've unplugged it because I'm tearing things apart back there and kind of redoing my office. But that should be plugged in. And then downstream from that are two of the 2.5 Unified Flex switches. And those were there for testing and updating, but I'll probably remove those and use those somewhere else. So then if we go back over here, again, downstream from my Switch Aggregation Pro, then I have my 48 port PoE switch. And this connects a majority of my devices. So downstream from this, let's just start over here, is my U7 Outdoor Pro, and that's outside creating a wireless bridge to my garage, and it's also giving me coverage outdoors, but it does create a bridge to the device bridge that's in the garage, and that's connected to the PoE 8-port light, which gives it power and connectivity, and from here, this connects to a lot of cameras, and maybe some more stuff in the future. And I did have this Office Workbench switch out there just for testing, but I removed it. I should probably remove it from here and reset it. But if we go to the next device downstream from my 48 PoE switch, I have the PDU for power management. I have 2 Flex devices. Those are the ones you saw on the wall, and that's just to give me more ports on the wall. Then I have a living room USW Ultra 210. And so this is another PoE switch that's in my living room that's powering some cameras. It's powering a mini switch, the Flex switch, and that goes behind my TV for the Xbox and some devices up there. And then this also powers the U6 Mesh, which is that small little access point that I have in my living room just for some more coverage and to give my doorbell some more coverage. That's specifically why I got it. And then connected to there, you might have saw that U7 Pro on top of my server rack. I meant to mount that a long time ago, but it actually fits nice there. And it covers some of the devices above there and actually some of the devices outside too. So downstream from this, I have the USB plug. Really, it's just connected over wireless. But this is an IoT device from Ubiquiti that will automatically toggle my ONT on and off if it detects a problem with my internet connection. Super handy. I've had it for years and it's saved me quite a few times. We talked about the Flex. So then next to here is the U7 Pro Max, and that's the access point that's right outside of my office. And it's the access point that a majority of the devices in my house connect to. It's central, it's the highest up, and it's a really good access point. So most of my devices end up connecting to this one. And that's it as far as topology goes. If you noticed, I have quite a few VLANs. I have one for cameras, one for guest, one for main, one for IoT, one for servers trusted, and one for untrusted. A couple of these went away because I made some changes. So here's my network setup, or the way it used to be. So I have my default network where a lot of my devices are connected. This is where all of my networking devices live and all of my Ubiquiti devices live. And the only other devices that live there are devices that need access to all VLANs. So the camera VLAN, pretty self-explanatory. This is where all of my cameras live. And this VLAN is pretty special because I actually blocked the internet from this VLAN. These cameras shouldn't reach out to the internet. Anyways, they should connect back to UniFi Protect. But just in case, for some reason, they decided to go to the internet one day, they're not going to be able to make it. So that's what I do wholesale across this camera VLAN. Because I don't want any devices on there to ever go out to the internet. They have no reason to, because I self-host UniFi Protect here. Then there's the IoT VLAN, which is for all of my IoT devices, and it's also for things that I don't trust. Now, I use the term trust loosely. We'll talk more about what I do trust and what I don't trust and why I don't trust some things. But I don't trust any of my IoT devices, so they go here. And this is one thing that has changed. My Kubernetes node isn't here. I actually have a network adapter here. So it's not really a node, so I'm going to take that off. You'll be happy to know that I moved my wife's laptop off the IoT VLAN. Her work laptop, I didn't have a great place to put it. I threw it on the IoT VLAN, but I've taken it off since then. And this is where any device goes that I test. I should probably have my own test VLAN too that doesn't have access to the internet. So that I can really test it in isolation, just in case, something was compromised or sent to me, compromised. But right now I test them on my IoT VLAN. Then there's the main VLAN for everything that I trust. And when I say trust, it's not that I trust it with my life or anything like that. It's more that I trust this device enough to sign into it, to do taxes on it, and to, put my personal information on that device. Now, would I put my personal information on any of these IoT devices? Heck no. And so that's kind of how I think about it. I mean, do I trust my HomePods with my life? No, I don't, obviously. But do I trust them enough to talk to them or to sign in with my iCloud account? Yes, I do. So this is kind of where those devices live on this main VLAN. Then I have a guest VLAN for everyone who never comes over because I never have any guests. It's true. And here's one of the biggest changes from last year. I'm not using servers untrusted anymore. Since setting up my colocation, I moved all of my untrusted servers and some of my public services there. So I don't self-host most public services out of my house anymore. So really, this whole thing could go over here. And then I could just basically say that, hey, this is my colocation over here. So this would be home, and this would be my colo over here. So what I ended up doing was creating a site-to-site VPN between my colocation and my home so that some of my trusted devices can get to them directly, and then this can serve out, the services through the internet. And this is how I ended up doing it. I have home, I have a site-to-site VPN, not using Tailscale, that was one of my decisions, and then my colocation. And so I just traverse the network through a site-to-site VPN. This is hosting a lot of my public services, and then this is hosting a lot of my internal home lab services here. If you want to see some of the decision points and how things are organized, I have a video on that. The dashboard that I'm using is Homepage. Now I switched to this year, and Homepage is great for a lot of reasons. One, it has a ton of flexibility, so you can customize this the way that you want. It supports a lot of services. As you can see, a lot of them are connected here. That's another point, is that you can get data back from those services and present it here in a little card. And it still does the simplest thing, which is a link on this page to get to some of your services. But one of the reasons why I like this the most is because it's all configuration based. And what do I mean by that? Well, you can configure everything about this dashboard in YAML. Now, I know a lot of people don't like YAML and they want a WYSIWYG editor. That's totally fine. But for me personally, I'd rather do it in YAML because then my YAML file can be easily backed up and it doesn't require space on the disk where this is running. That's really important for things like Kubernetes because now this runs stateless and you don't need to mount a volume to this container, and then you could scale it as much as you want. For example, we saw my hypervisor column, and then in here, you could see all of my PVE servers, and then I had these variables in a .env file. But you can see how simple it is. I could copy and paste this a few times and get a few more Proxmox servers just by doing this. Then I have a containers column, DNS column, so on and so forth. So I really like this way to configure stuff rather than using a WYSIWYG editor or drag and drop or anything like that. Don't get me wrong, they're lovely and they work great. But for me, I want to be able to repeat this super easy and keep this configuration, say, in a configuration store like Kubernetes. My hypervisor of choice is still Proxmox, and for a good reason. Proxmox is a wonderful hypervisor. Not only is it open source and based on KVM, but it also has a wonderful web GUI to manage all of this. It can scale and you can run it in HA if you want. It can run LXC containers, and you can run Ceph to have distributed storage across all of these hypervisors that you're running in your cluster. So lots of great features. Many of them I don't even use, but I do have 4 nodes in my Proxmox cluster. Now I actually have 2 Proxmox clusters. I'll show you the second one here in a second. But this is my first cluster. First up, I have Storinator. And for the time being, I converted Storinator to a Proxmox node rather than installing something on it bare metal, because it gives me all of the niceties from Proxmox, like backups and all of that, easy to connect to shares. So I decided that, hey, I'm going to turn that into a Proxmox node, and then I can run all of these virtual machines on here. I think that's going to change. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the NAS section, if that's any clue. But on here, I have a lot of test machines. I actually have a GitHub runner here. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I have 3 GitHub runners that run CI for some of my repos from GitHub when people open pull requests. I have them running here locally. I'll talk about it later. But pretty cool that I can run and execute CI from GitHub, the public version, and run those runners here locally. And then I have 5 test K3s nodes. I'll talk about that a little bit later and what they're for. And then I have PBS running, so Proxmox Backup Server, running as a virtual machine. I'll kind of dive into that a little bit later. Then some DNS servers and some other servers just for testing. You can see I was testing Unraid here, TrueNAS. It's wonderful that I can actually test other NAS systems on Proxmox. It's pretty awesome. And this Unraid, I was actually passing through the USB key where my production version of Unraid was installed. And that was one quick way I was able to virtualize it, was just plug in that key, pass it to the virtual machine, and I didn't need to configure anything else. So the next 3 nodes are those Intel NUCs you saw that I said I have in a cluster. And each of them are running similar VMs or containers that the other ones are running. So for instance, if I look at HA Proxy 1 on this node 1, or if I look at HA Proxy 2 on node 2, or HA Proxy 3 on node 3. So what I've done is spread these out for HA, and on my 1 node for Proxmox, I put all of my 1 guest machines. The same for 2, and then the same for 3. So this really helps me coordinate shutdowns. So for instance, if I wanted to use Ansible to patch all of the 3 devices, I know that all of the 3 devices live on this Proxmox node 3. So I'll run my Ansible command to update all of these machines, and then I'll update the host, so Shing3, and then I'll reboot it, and then they'll come back up. And because this is HA, for the most part, these services will stay running. And so I use that convention pretty much anywhere because I'll always know that if it's a -01, it's going to live on node 1, node 2, and node 3, and so on and so forth. But HA Proxy, this was for testing. Postgres was for testing. And then you'll see here I have my K8s Home 01 and my K8s Home Worker 01. So this is one of my 3 Kubernetes clusters. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is the server node, or the node that has etcd and control plane for Kubernetes. That's the -01. And then the -02 on node 2 is also that role. And the same for 3. On node 3, this -3 is running Kubernetes, etcd, and control plane. So those 3 nodes just manage this Kubernetes cluster and the state and the API. And then on each of them, I have worker nodes that pick up some of the pods that I deploy to them. So as I deploy services through Kubernetes, they'll just land on one of these nodes. Which nodes? I don't really care as long as it lands on one of them. And then if this node goes down, it'll shuffle those around and continue on working. My second Proxmox cluster is actually in my colocation. So I moved those 3 1U servers to my colocation, and each of those 3 1U servers are running Proxmox. And then within each one of these, I'm running different VMs and LXC containers. That's a big change this year too. So let's talk about these 3. Again, I have the same convention here. Node 1 has Postgres 1, HA Proxy 1, MongoDB 1, MySQL 1, Rancher 1, DNS 1, K8s Public 1, and K8s Public Worker 1. It's a lot going on there. And the same for 2, same exact thing, and the same for 3, as you can see. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this, but last year I was running a lot of my databases in Kubernetes. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with running databases in Kubernetes if it's architected the right way. I didn't architect mine the right way. And the biggest takeaway from this is to not use a database in a shared service server. So as you can see, I have a lot of virtual machines in here. And a lot of things that are sensitive to latency. Databases are one, and etcd is another. And so I had databases running in Kubernetes on this host that's also hosting all of these containers and virtual machines. So not a great mix. If I had more machines, what I would do is just dedicate a couple of nodes, specifically 2 databases, and let the databases run there. Then they don't have to worry about competing for CPU and IO and network. They could have their own dedicated per node. So anyways, I learned a ton. I learned that, hey, if I want to run databases in Kubernetes, I need some more hardware, or at least better hardware. If these were all on NVMe, it'd probably work, which I'd love to do in the future, and I'm thinking about doing it. But anyways, on this first node, I have PostgreSQL. So this is the first node in this Postgres cluster. And if you want to see how to configure Postgres HA, I have a great video on it. Doesn't use Docker, doesn't use Kubernetes. I called it PostgreSQL the hard way. Kind of, a tip in my hat to Kubernetes the hard way, because this is really the step-by-step manual way of showing you how to do it for Postgres. So if you need a database and something supports Postgres, always choose Postgres. It's great. But anyways, I have node 1, 2, and 3, and this is HA. I can shut this LXC container down, and my databases will continue to run. HA Proxy is actually a proxy in front of Postgres to kind of, field those requests and send them to the nodes that are alive. And the same thing, I have 1, 2, and 3. This 2 is actually down. There's something weird going on where I can't start it, so I don't know. I'm going to have to restore it or delete it. I probably should have done that already. But as you can see, 1 is down right now, and HA Proxy is handling it just fine. 1 and 3 are up. Actually, with HA Proxy, you only need 2 nodes for high availability, but that's besides the point. I did 3 just because I have 3 nodes. Anyways, that aside, it runs great. Then I have MongoDB. If you're not familiar with MongoDB, it's really a NoSQL database. And so it doesn't use SQL at all. It uses documents. But it's pretty popular among JavaScript developers and for things that aren't relational. Actually, it can do relational stuff now. And at the same time, relational databases can do schemaless or NoSQL type databases too with documents. It's all crazy. They're just intermingling now. But anyways, I use that for a lot of my external services and some of my internal services too. So again, I have 3 of them, 1, 2, 3. This is HA, could take one down, pass it around, and then, one will get promoted and my services will continue to run. Same with MySQL. Full disclosure, this isn't working exactly the way I want it to. MySQL is a little bit harder to do than Mongo and Postgres. So full disclosure, this isn't fully working. I'm not going to pretend like it is, but eventually I will move my MySQL stuff to here. And you're probably saying to yourself right now, why isn't he using MariaDB? Why is he using MySQL? Well, MariaDB used to be a drop-in replacement for MySQL. Now they started diverging. So MariaDB is doing some things that MySQL isn't doing. And some services that I use only are tested with MySQL, and I've already found some services that don't work with MariaDB. And it goes back and forth. You might find some services that were built and tested with MariaDB, but don't work with MySQLDB. So we're in a weird situation right here. And I don't blame the developers of those services. They have limited staff and they can't test every single database. And so they're only going to certify or ensure that their service runs fine on the database of their choice. So in the future, I'm probably going to have a MariaDB database in here too, as soon as I run a service that says they only test with that. But anyways, I plan to fix this. I just haven't had time yet. Then you'll see I have Rancher, Rancher 01, and then Rancher 02, Rancher 03. So this is my Rancher cluster. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but I have 3 Kubernetes clusters, all managed with Rancher, and these are the 3 VMs that help me do it. Next, I have DNS01. So I have DNS01. I don't have DNS02 on 2, which is kind of weird, so I should probably move it and shuffle that around. But I have DNS02, and I have 2 DNS servers here. I'm going to talk about what I'm using for DNS a little bit later, but just know in my colo, I have my own DNS servers there too. Next, I have K8s Public 01. Again, this is another Kubernetes cluster, and this is for all of my public services, my self-hosted services that I provide for people like you. So my documentation, some other stuff, APIs, used to have Wiki.js, but I have a lot of things out there in the public that I want to host, and so those run on this cluster right here. And then like my home cluster, so the -1, -2, -3 are really for managing Kubernetes. It's Kubernetes itself. So it's etcd, control plane are running on those 3 servers. So it's managing the state of Kubernetes, as well as having the API for kube control commands. Then I have 3 worker nodes, 1 on each Proxmox node. And that's where all of my user services run. So my documentation is running on there right now. If you go to my documentation, you'll actually get routed to one of 3 of these because I run 3 replicas. So my documentation is HA and I run 3 replicas, and there should be 1 on each one of these nodes. So where you get sent to, I don't know, but I know it'll be one of the 3. And then I have, templates, other random VMs, and, all of my shares connected. But this is my second Proxmox cluster in my co-location. And since I was lucky enough to get a co-location and put my service there, that's where I put a lot of my public services too. And that's what helped shape my home network now. So I don't need that untrusted server VLAN anymore because I only have trusted servers there because all of the public stuff that I'm hosting is in my co-location. So a lot of changes over the last year and more to come for sure. That is a lot on hypervisors and a lot on Proxmox because I love Proxmox. It's awesome. But there's one more thing with Proxmox. It's not Proxmox itself, but it's Proxmox Backup Server. So I use Proxmox Backup Server to back up all of my machines. And this Proxmox Backup Server lives in a virtual machine on my machine back here at home. The cool thing is that I have it configured as a target for both my co-location machines and my machines here at home. So you can see I created 2 data stores, TrueNAS DC and TrueNAS Home. So TrueNAS, that's the name of where the storage lives. So it's living on TrueNAS over NFS. It's a little bit of a hack, but it works great. Might change it in a little bit, but not important. I have a data store that's stored on TrueNAS for my data center and one for home. And you can see I'm not too bad. So the data center is using 504 gigabytes and home is using 2.62 terabytes. Now you can tweak your backups with garbage collection jobs, prune jobs, tell it how many you want to keep, how many you want to let go, and how often all of those jobs run. But the cool thing about it is it deduplicates a lot of this too. So even though I have, 504 gigs that's used in this data store, I think if I restored that, it'd be a lot more than that because a lot of things are deduplicated, like things in the OS and stuff like that. I think that's how it works. But yeah, it works great. And if you're curious about what it can and can't do, I got a short video on it just explaining an overview of how to do it and how I set mine up. As for storage, I'm using TrueNAS for all of my storage services. That means SMB, NFS, iSCSI, and even object storage. And I'm running the Electric Eel version, which means I have Docker for apps instead of Kubernetes. But you can see some of my stats about my NAS. I have 128 gigs of RAM. I have a pretty okay CPU in here. It's a Bronze Intel Xeon. It only has 6 cores running at 1.9 gigahertz. Now, that's great for power usage. It's low power Intel, if there's such a thing. But it's pretty good on power, all things considered. And I do need a Xeon because I need all of those lanes. Could be AMD, but I'm just saying I need a server-grade processor so I can get all of these lanes for all of these devices in here. So if you want to see how my disks are laid out, I think we can go right here. But I have 5 mirrors that are too wide. So I have mirrored VDEVs and I have 5 of them. So I have 10 14 terabyte drives in there. And so I'm kind of losing half of my storage because I'm using mirrored VDEVs. But I did that because it's easy to expand my pool by just adding 2 more drives. And that's why I did it, plus some performance reasons. Even though it's kind of expensive, every time I need to add more storage, I got to buy 2 drives and I get half of that storage. I decided that, that's best for me for right now. Kind of committed to this because I don't have a really good way to move that data off to something else. I don't have 40 terabytes somewhere where I could move this off and then change my layout and move it back on. So I'm kind of, stuck with it for a little bit. But there might be something in the future that could change to where I can do that. So anyways, but you can see I have a log VDEV or my slog. So I have a mirror 2 wide, and that's a 112 gigabyte Intel Optane drives, and I have those mirrored. And then a cache drive, which I probably don't need, but I put them in there anyways. I have 2 of those as well. No spare VDEVs and nothing for dedupe. So it's, a pretty standard installation. You can see here, mirror, 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 and then 2 cache drives. And then my log or my slog is also mirrored. And I think I'm going to optimize this in the future and move my metadata off the main pool just so I can get some better performance when I open up folders that have, hundreds of files. I notice it kind of crawls, but I do have folders that have hundreds of thousands of files inside of them. So I think moving my metadata to a group of super fast drives, that will help speed up some performance. I don't know. We'll see. I have 2 10 gig NICs on here and they're bonded and set up in a lag. As far as applications go, I only have 1 application running on here right now, and that's Minio or MinIO, and that's object storage. And so if you think of things like S3 or Google Cloud Storage, GCS, or whatever Azure has for storage, it's really just S3 or object storage. And this is the open source self-hosted version. And so this is really handy because a lot of my backups or a lot of my services, at least in Kubernetes or containers, they always like to back up to object storage, which is awesome. I agree, it should be object storage. And so I want to host that myself. And so I host it with Minio. Now, Minio used to be on TrueNAS proper. It wasn't an application. And then they took it off and now it is an application, which I think is the right way to go too. I'm most likely going to move all of my home production services here. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit later too. But the gist of it is I want something a little bit more simple for my home production. I want to make sure that when I hit a button for Home Assistant, it's going to work. I want to make sure that Plex is always up and running. And the highest available of all of my servers is my NAS. If my NAS is down, there's big problems. I do everything possible to keep my NAS up. And it should be always running in my environment. And so since my NAS is always running, I figure some of my home lab services and my home production should run here too. And by home production, I mean all of the services that I need and rely on and depend on. And my home lab stuff that runs on my NUC and elsewhere are things that can be down and no one will notice. That's kind of how I separate it. If I'm running services and they're down and someone notices, then I should consider that home production. So I'm going to move all of them here. Another reason why I do it too is because, well, I get easy snapshots. I get a lot of caching and performance that I get from my ZFS stuff. At least I think I do with TrueNAS. I need to look into that. But I've done so much to optimize my TrueNAS server, and now that they have Docker, it just totally makes sense to put all of my containers running here. And I'm pretty excited for it. I really am. Now that we're past hypervisors and backups, now it's time for DNS. The DNS that I am still using is Pi-hole. I don't see any reason to change it anytime soon. I know that Unified Network can now manage CNAMEs and do DNS for you, and there are other DNS systems out there, but I'm super comfortable with Pi-hole. It lets me easily create DNS records, CNAME records, and I can replicate those across all of my nodes with Gravity Sync. Now, I know that there are better things out there, but I like Pi-hole, and it works really good. Gives me easy way to disable stuff, gives me an easy way to see which domains are being used, gives me an easy way to block domains, get ad lists, I get a lot of stuff, and it works really, really good. So I don't see a reason to change. I kind of want to keep things semi-simple at home because I'm a person of one. So Pi-hole is just that for me. It works great. I can't complain. And so the way that I have my DNS set up, I have 3 DNS systems here at home. So I have, DNS1, DNS2, and DNS3. And then I use QVIP to create a virtual IP for my second DNS. It's a little wild, but there's a method to my madness. So if you look at it, think of this like this is my primary DNS. So it's 192.168.60.10. And then the VIP that KeepAliveD creates is my second DNS that I hand out in my DHCP scope. And so this one is actually .22. So let me label this 1, 2, 3. So the reason I did this is because these two right here are actually virtual machines within my home lab. Well, if that big server rack goes down or I reboot my hypervisors or whatever, the thing tips over or gets disconnected, normally that would mean I don't have DNS. But number 3 will save the day because this is on the wall and this is a Pi-0 and it's running Pi-hole and this VIP will still be up, but now the traffic will be routed to here. So it gives me a super simple, low power way to still serve out DNS if my whole entire server rack goes down, which it happens, I need to reboot stuff or accidentally unplug stuff. So that's why I did that. But then to make matters even more confusing, what I ended up doing in my colocation is spinning up 2 more Pi-hole servers. And think of this really like 4 and 5. So this is what I was saying, I have 5 DNS servers. But what I realize is that if I have a VPN connection to these, I might need to access the same DNS records here at home and here in my colocation. What I ended up doing is running Gravity Sync and synchronizing everything over. So really 1 is my primary DNS, and this is where I make all of my changes. So I make all of my changes here. Then Gravity Sync will push these changes out to all of these machines. So I had to do very little besides spin these up and set up Gravity Sync and just tell it, hey, number 1 is the source of truth. So it's pretty awesome. It shares lists, shares DNS records, shares CNAMEs. So it works out really, really good. So this is why I have 5 DNS servers. I think it worked out pretty good. I mean, this is like me hacking and home labbing and trying to do a colo at the same time. I think it turned out pretty good. I do wish that Pi-hole had first-class support for this, maybe in version 2. But to be able to run these, in a cluster and be able to easily synchronize them would be great. But in the meantime, we have tools to do this. So the only thing I have to keep telling myself is never make changes on any of these. Always make my changes on 1, and those will replicate out. So pretty fun. It's been fun figuring out all of this with Pi-hole. It's pretty versatile, as you can see. For home security, I'm using Unified Protect. Huge fan of Unified Protect. It's such a great application. And on top of that, their cameras are relatively cheap for what you get. And on top of that, it's all local. So all of this is recording local on my NVR. Now, I used to have that UDM SE that had 1 drive in there, but I ended up buying an NVR and that has 4 drives. So you can see that my storage capacity right now is going back 33 days. It's pretty good. I need to add another drive in here and I could probably get some more storage, but 33 days for almost 10 cameras is pretty good. And not only does it keep these recordings local, but a lot of them have smart, You can see right here, I hooked a camera up to my 3D printer, so I'm printing a spool right now. And not only does all of this stay local, I also get AI features like object detection and facial recognition and stuff like that with these cameras. So huge fan of Protect. It just keeps getting better. Now, containers are a huge topic, so I'm gonna break this up into two sections. First, we're gonna have containers, or the engine that I use and run, and then we'll have orchestration, basically Kubernetes. Spoiler alert. But with containers, I actually made a big change this year and moved stuff back to Docker. For a long time, I was going all in with Kubernetes at home. And since I was hosting things at home, and since I was also hosting my public services at home, it got pretty complicated pretty quick. I always had to be sure that I was deploying things to the right VLAN or to the right node to be sure that, hey, this is the public-facing service and not an internal service. And I did a pretty good job at it, but I realized it was just getting way too complicated. Now, I manage a lot of clusters at work, and I still manage all of my public services with Kubernetes, those 3 clusters that I have, and some of my home services. But I decided that my home production now is going to be Docker. Along with less complexity, there are actually less points of failure now too. If you think about it with Kubernetes, it could be one of any node goes down. I know that the service would then spin up somewhere else after a period of time. But then that's connected to my NAS for different types of data. And so if my NAS is down, that's down. Or if my nodes are down, it's down. So I decided that I'm going to keep all of my services together and limit my points of failure. And so I ended up creating a virtual machine in Proxmox that has all of my containers running. So this is my home production right now, virtual machine running Docker on Proxmox. That's going to change here in a little bit. And even though I'm showing you Portainer, I manage all of this with Docker Compose. Now, I use Portainer every now and then just to see how things are doing or to look at the logs. But for the most part, I SSH into that machine and then manage them there. So there you can see I have my AI stack. We'll talk about that a little bit later. My home assistant stack, still going to talk about that. Homepage, which we talked about. Plex, which we're going to talk about too. Portainer, scripted, we'll talk about. Tautoli, traffic, and Watchtower. So these are all stacks that are running on that virtual machine. But soon, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be moving all of these containers over to TrueNAS Scale. So since TrueNAS Scale has containers now and has Docker support and not Kubernetes, I'm going to put all of my containers there. And I mentioned that earlier, but I wanted to make it clear that I'll no longer have a VM running Docker on it. I'm moving all of that to TrueNAS Scale and running that there. So it's only one point of failure, and that NAS has pretty good uptime because if that NAS is down, there are lots of problems. So lots of migration still yet to come. And for container orchestration, I'm using Kubernetes. How'd you guess? But I am using Kubernetes. I have 3 Kubernetes clusters we talked about a little bit earlier, and I'm using Rancher to manage all of that. So how does that work? Well, I made a lot of changes to my Kubernetes clusters this year, especially. So my Rancher cluster is running RKE2, and it's upstream of everything else. So if you think about it, I installed RKE2, then I started running Rancher on there. And then from there, I provisioned more clusters downstream. So I have my home cluster downstream and I have my public cluster downstream. But this is really cool about Rancher is that I can manage all 3 of these clusters right from here. And so I have a single pane of glass to manage all of my clusters. If I wanted to do something like make a single node cluster on my Storinator after I move everything out of there, which I might do, I easily could. A cluster of 1, give it all roles, and then I manage it here from Rancher. So pretty awesome. Now, I will say that I use this UI basically for read-only. This is just my dashboard to inspect things really quick or to quickly kill a pod or anything like that. But it's an easy way for me to see how my cluster is doing from mobile or from web without SSHing into those machines. I use GitOps to manage the state of my cluster, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But I'm a huge fan of Rancher. Even if I had a cluster of 1, I probably would install Rancher on it just because I get so many features from it and I get so much visibility from it. And it's so accessible through a website. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say it uses a lot of resources. Yeah, but I get a lot of use out of those resources. I get a lot of value out of installing it and managing clusters. And now I'm managing 3 clusters. Pretty soon it'll be 4 clusters. And so doing it this way, or at least provisioning those clusters with Rancher and having them all report back to Rancher is awesome. It's golden. I love doing it. And upgrades are super simple too. But I do a lot of that with GitOps too. So just think of Rancher, at least for me, as a way to create and manage new Kubernetes clusters. And when I say manage, I don't mean manage deployments. I mean manage nodes, add, remove nodes, things like that. So in my home cluster are all of my home containers. So it's some of the services you've already seen, some that you will see. And then it's a test bed for a lot of my other Kubernetes stuff. Public is where all of my public services are running. So these are things that are publicly available to really anyone. And then obviously, as I mentioned a few times, I have my Rancher cluster, which manages the state of all of the clusters. And it's an easy way to create new clusters. For example, if I wanted to create a cluster, I could click create there. I could say, hey, it's going to be a harvester or a custom cluster. Custom is probably what I want. I would choose my Kubernetes version, RKE2 or K3S, choose the one I want. And then I would choose a unique name. So I would call it test. And then I would click create. I'm not going to do it. And then from there, it would give you a couple of CLI commands to run on any Linux machine, and they'll automatically join the cluster and give it the roles that you tell it. So super easy to create a Kubernetes cluster once you have this running. And the other kind of containers I now run are LXC containers. So what are LXC containers? Well, they're lightweight Linux containers that actually share the kernel with Linux, so they're not totally isolated. But you can think of them as simple, lightweight virtual machines. That's the way I like to think about them. But it actually shares the kernel with the host that it's on. So super awesome, super fast. So if you don't like Docker containers or CRI containers where you're basically isolating an application, LXC might be for you because you can create an LXC container, install what you want, and manage it almost exactly like a VM, but with a fraction of the resources. So I talked about this a little bit earlier and what they are, but my HA proxy, MongoDB, these are all containers right here that I'm running right on Proxmox. So super cool. If you want an easy way to create containers or virtual machines, just check out Proxmox helper scripts. I have a video on it. Super awesome. If you're new to Proxmox, it's great. Or even if you know everything about Proxmox, it's still really awesome to be able to run these scripts to create a lot of these services. So check it out. I have a video on it. So GitOps is a huge topic. And if you don't know what GitOps is, it's really just a practice that says that your Git repo should be the source of truth. And so what people like to do is create infrastructure as code. So what they'll do is write code, which is their infrastructure, and they'll use a CI process to deploy that out to whatever the system is. And so a good example of this is with Kubernetes. So if I want to, for example, deploy homepage right here in my home cluster, this is how I do it. I would commit this resource to my GitHub repo. I would push it up, and then there's a CI process that will deploy that. And so what you end up doing is not really managing your cluster through a UI or through manual convention. You do it all through Git. So really, your Git repo becomes the source of truth rather than the cluster itself. And this is why I was saying earlier with Rancher, I don't make any changes in the Rancher UI. I make changes to YAML, deploy that YAML, or push it up in a commit, and then the process will take over, which is Flux, and apply those changes. So Flux is what I use for GitOps. It's pretty awesome. There's also Argo CD, which is really awesome. I just got into Flux really early, and so I'm still here on Flux. I do want to check out Argo CD. I don't really want to rewrite a lot of this though for Argo CD. Maybe I'll do it for my public cluster because there's less running there. But really cool. I do wish there was GitOps for Docker. It kind of seems like an oxymoron doing production stuff with Docker Compose, but I wish there was a way to do GitOps with Docker Compose because I think that would, satisfy both of my needs for wanting to keep things simple and doing Docker and YAML, but at the same time using my Git repo as the source of truth and then having that deploy some way. So it totally is something that no one should ever build, but I would love it if someone did. And then along with GitOps, I actually use a tool called Renovate to help me manage my updates. And it's really cool. So I self-host this thing from Mend called Renovate. And it's a bot that's running in my cluster. And that bot will go out and check some of the resources that I have and see if there are newer versions of those resources. So for example, if you could see on Git homepage, I'm using version 0.10.19. But if we look at the last change right here, you can see I got a pull request from Technoboto, that's my bot, to make a change. And this change is replace this line right here with this line. And you can see the container image went from 0.10.6 to 0.10.9. And so it saw that there was an update in this container, opened up a pull request, and then I got a pull request from this bot, and all I have to do is approve it. That's what's cool about GitOps too. So after I approved and merged in that PR, the GitOps process takes over and it will deploy the latest version of this container. So it's really awesome. I don't need to manage updates anymore, at least not in conventional ways. I wait for pull requests from a bot that shows me not only the version, but also some of the differences, if there's differences in the change log. And then I get to decide whether I want to update it or not. And I do that all from a mobile device or web page, just saying, yes, approve. And a couple minutes later, I get the latest version of the container. So it's another reason why I love GitOps, but I use Renovate to do that. For my reverse proxy, I'm still running Traefik. Now, I think I have 4 instances of Traefik running. So I have Traefik running on my Docker machine to serve all of my traffic over HTTPS, along with certificates for all of my home and home production stuff. Then I think I have 3 or 4 instances of Traefik within Kubernetes. And those are for different things. Like I have an internal version of Traefik running in Kubernetes to serve traffic, to me over the VPN versus out publicly. And then I have another instance of Traefik that's used for a reverse proxy to serve that traffic out publicly with certificates. Now, that's a lot of information, and if you don't know what a reverse proxy is, at its core, a reverse proxy is a proxy that takes requests and will send those requests based on their HTTP headers to downstream services. If you think about it, you could have your reverse proxy in front of different services like TrueNAS or Proxmox or Rancher. And so that's what's handling those requests. And as they come in, it will look at the header and see where it should be routed and then route it accordingly, according to your configuration. So, it's a reverse proxy because if you think of a forward proxy, everyone coming together and going through one thing, well, this is reverse. It's everyone coming in and then going out to different things. So I love Traefik. I've been running it for a long time. I run it in Docker now and 3 or 4 on Kubernetes. It's great. In the Docker version, I use Traefik to get my certificates from Let's Encrypt using Cloudflare, Let's Encrypt, and that works great for Docker. In Kubernetes, I'm using Cert Manager to manage my certificates. And all that's really doing is saying, hey, Traefik isn't responsible for getting and storing my certificates. Cert Manager is. So Cert Manager will actually do that. It will go out, request new certificates, pull them down, put them as configuration within Kubernetes, and then Traefik can use those since it's a shared resource within Kubernetes. So in Docker, I use Traefik to get and manage certificates. In Kubernetes, I use Cert Manager to do it, but then they're still used by Traefik. So a little bit of nuance there. Monitoring and logging, and I wish I had a better story for this. So last time I was saying, I want to do more monitoring and logging, don't we all? And at that time, I was using Uptime Kuma to monitor some of my services, especially my internal services. And now that my internal services are kind of all spread out, I took down Uptime Kuma, and I'm not actually monitoring anything internal. I know that's bad. I wait for someone to scream. But for external services, I monitor all of those with Uptime Robot. So I don't need to worry about my public services being monitored. I still want to monitor some of my internal services. Now, I did stop using Uptime Kuma, even though it's great. Had nothing to do with it itself, although it does get slow sometimes. I mainly stopped using it because it uses a SQLite database, and that SQLite database required storage. in Kubernetes, which is kind of a nightmare. And that storage would either get corrupted or that storage would disconnect from my pods and it would be down. So the last time I used it, it did get corrupted and I said, I'm not using it anymore. So now that it's going to Docker and it's going to live on my NAS, yeah, I'll probably end up using it again. It's just that Kubernetes made it a little bit complicated. And I think there's a version of Uptime Kuma now coming that uses MariaDB, which I'm excited about because it means the state of your Uptime Kuma now lives in a database versus a SQLite database that's on disk. So much better architecture coming in the future. Looking forward to that. I did use Gaddis for a little bit, and it's a great monitoring system, a little bit different than Uptime Kuma. I think it has more of a developer lens on it. But the nice thing about Gaddis is that it's stateless. So you manage all of the configuration and code with YAML, and that will configure all of your uptime monitors that way. So you're not doing it through a UI. So pretty cool for Kubernetes because you can use a config map for the configuration, and then it's totally stateless, and then you can scale it and you don't need to worry about storage. But since I moved a lot of my home prod services out of my home Kubernetes cluster, I didn't have a use for Gaddis for monitoring internally anymore. So anyways, a lot to figure out there. If you want something that's cool and different, Gaddis is the way to go. I have a video too. For data visualization, I'm embarrassed to say I'm not using Grafana. Now, I've used a lot of those tools at work in the past, and I kind of decided that I don't want to use those tools here at home too. Now, I might set those up for my colocation because that's a little bit different. That's running Kubernetes. But for here at home, I ended up finding out that Home Assistant is actually really good to monitor and visualize some of your services at home. Now, I'm not talking about monitoring the temperature or humidity in your home lab. I'm talking about monitoring things like Proxmox, TrueNAS, Docker, you name it. As a quick example, I set up a quick dashboard with Plex, with Pi-hole, with TrueNAS, and even some of the services that are running on TrueNAS, and I can manage it all from here. So if I wanted to turn FTP on and off right here, I could, or if I wanted to see who's watching something on Plex, I definitely could, or to see Pi-hole or quickly toggle it off to get around the Pi-hole blocking system and then toggle it back on when I'm done. So there are lots of services that are already compatible with Home Assistant, and a lot of these do charting too. For instance, I created a network dashboard, and these are all of my network devices. So my EFG, my access points, my switches, and you can see right here, I created this little chart to see how many clients are connected to each one of these wireless devices. So on this one, there's 13, on this one, there's 26, and on this one, there's 5. And there's a lot you can do. This is only kind of scratching the surface. I think I might continue to use this, really because it puts all of this data in Home Assistant, which I'm already using, and I have an app for it. So pretty cool. I'm going to see if I can make some pretty cool dashboards too. I have a video on this covering all of this. It's really cool if you want to use Home Assistant for something like that. It's definitely better than nothing. Is it as advanced as Grafana and Loki? No, not at all. And I'm looking for simplicity along with a good user interface. And so Home Assistant gives me all of that. So speaking of home automation, all of my home automation is running on Home Assistant. One of the biggest changes I made this year was moving it out of Kubernetes and into Docker. And then this year, I'll be moving it from a Docker VM onto TrueNAS itself. But Home Assistant, need I say more? I mean, I can remote control everything in my house. I keep adding more and more things to Home Assistant, and it seems like every day there are more and more services that are being added. You can see a list of services that I have configured here and some of the entities that I have configured. And then from here, you can see quite a few devices that are connected. So my goal is to connect everything to Home Assistant. And then if I need to do things downstream from there, I will. What do I mean by that? Well, my wife and I use HomeKit, and it's nice to have, the Home app on Apple or tell Siri to do stuff. And the way that I do that is connect all of the devices to Home Assistant first, and then expose them to HomeKit with HomeKit Bridge. And so all of the non-certified devices, I can get into here and expose them as certified devices. So that gives us some more automation, like with Apple TVs or Siri and stuff like that. But for the most part, I try to get everything in Home Assistant first. And I've been managing some of my more complex automations here. So yeah, last year it was only kind of being used for a few things. Now everything's in here. I mean, you can see my 3D printer is in here right now. I mean, that's how far it's going. So I am going to continue to use this more and more, like I said, not only for home automation, but for some of my monitoring of some of my home lab services. So really cool. I love Home Assistant. It just keeps getting better and better. I talked a little bit earlier about home security, and I just talked about Home Assistant, and there's kind of something that's in between, which I use, which is Scripted. So Scripted can be an MVR, but the way I like to look at it is it's a system or an interface that allows you to connect most any camera to most any hub. And what do I mean by that? Well, I have my cameras provided by UniFi, right? UniFi Protect, and they're not HomeKit certified, which means they don't integrate with HomeKit at all. So when someone presses the doorbell, I don't get a notification on Apple TV or on Siri or anything like that. And so what Scripted can do is connect all of your cameras to a hub of your choice. Now I know it can connect to HomeKit. I think it can Google Home, Alexa, and a lot of these are supported, and a lot of different camera systems are supported. So anyways, I use this to get those video feeds into there for other reasons, but I use Scripted to do it. It's open source. It's awesome. Scripted can also be used as an MVR too. So really cool piece of open source software. For a link page, I use my link page still, and it's Little Link. And this is an open source project that I host on GitHub. A lot of people have contributed to it, but if you ever find yourself needing to host a bunch of links, you can do it with this. It's a Docker container that runs super small, lightweight, and it's all configurable with environment variables. So you have to do very little, pass in a couple environment variables, and you get buttons that you can click on to go different places. For a link shortener, I still use Schlink. Now, Schlink is open source, self-hostable, and I can create a whole bunch of URLs and then shorten them with my custom domain. You don't know what I'm talking about, think Bitly, but self-hosted, open source, and hosted within my infrastructure. You can create as many links as you want and send them wherever you want, and you also get some counts and metrics about those links. I've looked at a lot in this space, and this is the most modern and I think the most well-architected system that's out there. It uses Postgres on the database. They've separated the API from the client. Like, this is production ready, and I use it in production. And so most of my links that you see, the l.technotim.live/docs, will take you to my documentation page. And so that's helpful if I ever need to change a link. Let's say one day I don't want to host my docs on technotim.live anymore. Change that, and boom, it's done everywhere. So it's great to run, even if you need to manage just a few links. For my media server, I'm using Plex. I don't need to tell you how awesome Plex is, but I think it's really awesome, especially for recording live TV and over-the-air TV. And I've been doing that for many, many years, going back to Windows XP Media Center Edition. So I have a long history of recording over-the-air TV, and I do it here too. So that HD Home Run Quad gives me 4 tuners, or 4 separate channels, if you will, to record different channels within Plex. And I can also stream up to 4, although I only use 1. The other cool thing about recording TV is that you can skip commercials. It'll look for commercials and you can either cut them out or skip them. I usually mark them as skip, which makes watching the things I want to see that much better because they don't have commercials. And then this also saves me from getting subscriptions to other services like Hulu or Peacock. This used to be running on a Ubuntu virtual machine, then I moved it to Docker, then it was running on Windows, now it's back on Docker on a virtual machine, but soon I'm going to move it over to my NAS along with everything else. For power management, I'm still using NutServer. Now I use NutServer to manage 3 of my UPSs, so I have a Triplite UPS that you can see here. I have my APC backup that's on the wall, and then I have an Eaton UPS that's in there too, and this is this device here. Now, it's really nice because it's hard to see this data otherwise, and the other nice thing about NutServer is that you can coordinate shutdowns. Now, I used to do that, but a couple of times it didn't work out so well, so I've kind of eased back and I disabled that feature of NutServer, but it's there if you need it. Say, for instance, you want to shut down a machine safely when there's only 10% battery left, you can totally do that. But NutServer is a great way to look at your UPS and see how it's doing at a glance. I do wish there was something newer than NutServer, and there kind of is. There's this self-hosted service you could run called Peanut, and what it's doing is something I like, which is giving a modern facelift to NutServer itself. And we could see my different devices that I was just seeing in NutServer. You can switch between them, and it will plot out all of this data on this chart. The one thing though is that none of this data persists, so you'd have to keep this open for a really long time. And I hope in the future that some of this data gets persisted, maybe to a database or something like that, so we can see all of this data over time, because it's only good for right now. Like I said, unless you leave it open, then you'll see it plotted. But still, this is a great start to making a more modern version of NutServer. Content management systems. I think last year I had 3. So I was running WordPress, I was running Ghostblog, and I was also running Wiki.js. Now I'm down to 1. I wanted to get down to 1. And the way that I did it was by shutting down 2 of the 3. So I did shut down my WordPress blog because a lot of it was redundant with what I'm doing now on my documentation. So I shut that down, and I was actually glad to shut down WordPress because it's kind of a nightmare to manage. And then I shut down Wiki.js. We were using it in our Discord server for a while, but then they released version 2 and there was no upgrade path. And I think we all just kind of stopped using it. So since it wasn't getting any use with our Discord server, I did retire that. And so the last one that's up in my environment is Ghostblog, and that's for my wife's portfolio. So only one CMS system, and it's Ghostblog, which I think is the best out right now. As far as static site generators go, I'm running 2 still. So I'm running Jekyll and I'm running Hugo. Now they're kind of the same. They're both older tools, but the idea behind a static site generator is that you write Markdown and then it will generate markup for you. So for instance, with my documentation site, all I need to do is write these articles in Markdown, save them, and then when it generates the markup, you get nice looking articles like this. And they're great if you're not a designer or not really good at creating UIs, because you can just focus on the content that you're writing, and then the Markdown generator, the markup generator, will make it look nice for you. And also, I like managing even my documents as code. So I write this as code, it runs CI/CD against it, it transpiles or generates the markup for me, and then it puts it in a container, and then it puts it out in the public web, actually in my Kubernetes cluster, and then it's out in the public web, and then I do some stuff with Cloudflare, tell it to flush the cache. But again, I have CI and CD for this too, and I like doing it this way because it lets me manage my content as code. Speaking of CI and CD, I'm actually using 2 solutions right now. So CI is continuous integration and CD is continuous delivery. So what does that mean? Really, they're just concepts if you think about it. Continuous integration basically says like, hey, we're going to continuously integrate what you're working on with the rest of what everyone else is working on. So if you think of this like code, it's like, hey, you work on your own branch. At some point, you want to merge that branch into the main branch, and that's when your continuous integration would run. And so you might run tests, you might build containers, you might do anything you want to do, but that's the continuous integration piece. And then on the delivery side, a lot of people think of it like deployment. It can be deployment, but on that side, you're delivering some value. Now that could be an updated website, some features. It could be dropping off, a zip file somewhere. It's really up to you. And there really isn't a great definition for it, at least as far as what you deliver. And so really, it's just automating that entire process of building, testing, and delivering some content or delivering software to someone else. So I use 2 solutions for that. I use GitHub and GitLab. Those are source control systems, but with each, they now have CI integration. I mean, GitLab's had it from the beginning. And so GitLab has pipelines and runners. So when I commit code, at least specific code in my private GitLab, I have runners that will pick up that job and run the CI tasks. And so those runners are hosted in my Kubernetes cluster in my public cluster. And each time I push up code to a private repo that I have, It'll pull it down, run it, build it, deliver it, deploy it, whatever it needs to do. And that's all running in my Kubernetes cluster in the colocation. And then I also have GitHub runners for GitHub Actions. GitHub does it a little bit different, but they have things called GitHub Actions that run pipelines for you. And so I created runners that run here that actually run those actions. And it sounds kind of complicated. Now, I did that specifically because I have a K3s playbook that helps you bootstrap and create a Kubernetes cluster. Well, I wanted a way to actually test the changes that people make. So since it's open source, people open up PRs against this repo. And for a while, I was testing all of this on my own personal Kubernetes cluster, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here that I mentioned earlier. And this is where I would pull down their branch, run their Ansible playbook and see if it passed, and then merge in the PR if it did. That got really tedious really fast, as you can imagine, especially with more contributors. So what I ended up doing was creating my own GitHub action runners, 3 of them, and this will run the CI for those pull requests. So if someone makes a change to the K3s cluster Ansible playbook that I have, this GitHub action runner will pick it up. It will actually create the full Kubernetes cluster, all automated, all in CI, and run tests against it. And if they pass, it will, give a thumbs up or a green check mark on the CI for the pull request. And so that's something that took a long time and it took a lot of help from a lot of people, but it makes testing and accepting pull requests really easy, because if it doesn't pass CI, then there's no reason to merge it in. But anyways, I use 2 different CI and CD systems because I use both GitLab and GitHub. And then there's everything else like custom code I write to manage bots on Twitch, Twitter, and Discord. I'm running Longhorn on 2 Kubernetes cluster for my Kubernetes storage. I'm running NetBoot XYZ on my network so that my clients can boot to network and install operating systems, and that didn't fit into a category. And I'm even self-hosting some diagramming tools that you might have seen, but I didn't know where those fit in. This has been another awesome year in self-hosting, and I made a lot of changes going into 2025. And now throughout 2025, I'm going to make some of the biggest changes yet. Be sure you're subscribed so you can see those updates. I'm Tim. Thanks for watching.